The Treaty of Nice, concluded in 1538, stopped the fighting, but did not resolve the conflict between the French King Francis I and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Both monarchs were dissatisfied with the outcome of the war, since Francis I did not abandon the idea of establishing control over the Duchy of Milan, and Charles V continued to demand that the French king fulfill the terms of the Madrid Treaty concluded in 1526. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the French king dreamed of establishing control over Flanders and the Kingdom of Naples, and Charles V, in turn, wanted to establish his power over Burgundy. The parties tried to reach an agreement. Charles V offered to marry the youngest son of the French King Charles of Orleans to his daughter Mary. According to the plan, the newlyweds were to inherit Burgundy, the Netherlands, and the county of Ceresole after the death of Charles V, and Francis was to abandon plans to establish his power over the Duchy of Milan and Savoy. In turn, Francis was ready to renounce his claims to the Duchy of Milan only if Charles V immediately handed over the Netherlands to him. Realizing that it would not work out, Francis managed to find an ally within the Holy Roman Empire. It turned out to be Wilhelm Duke of Jülich, Cleve, Berg, who argued with Charles V for the right to own the Duchy of Guelders. The second ally of Francis I was the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman I, who promised that he would provide military assistance in the fight against Charles V. On March 8, 1542, Francis I agreed with the Ottoman Sultan on military assistance in the fight against Charles V and began preparations for hostilities. On July 12, 1542, Francis I declared war on Charles V. Very soon after the start of the war, Francis I began to disagree with the King of England Henry VIII, which was very untimely. The fact is that the French king planned to marry his son to the young Queen of Scotland Mary, which was contrary to the interests of the English crown. In order to prevent the efforts of French influence on the British island, Henry decided to make an alliance with Charles V against Francis I. The problem was that Charles V was a Catholic, while Henry was a schismatic. This fact significantly slowed down the process of negotiations, but in the end the two monarchs still managed to agree. June 22, 1543, Henry VIII declares war on Francis I. Very soon after the declaration of war, the English army lands at Calais. Meanwhile, French troops invaded the territory of the Netherlands, which belonged to the Habsburgs, and launched a successful offensive. Having learned about the invasion of French troops, Duke William openly went over to the side of the French king and, at the head of his army, began an invasion of Brabant. Francis I, at the head of the main army, also launched an offensive deep into the territory of the Holy Roman Empire, but having reached the outskirts of Reims, the army of Francis stopped for unknown reasons. Taking advantage of the inaction of the French king, Charles V, at the head of his army, invaded the Duchy of Jülich, Berg and, breaking the resistance of the Düren garrison, captured and plundered the city. Fearing that his only ally in the Holy Roman Empire, Duke William, would be defeated, Francis ordered his youngest son, the Duke of Orleans, to immediately attack Luxembourg, which would divert the army of Charles V. In turn, Charles V did not pay attention to the maneuvers of the Duke of Orleans and concentrated his efforts on the fight against Duke William. Already on September 7, having not received help from an ally, Wilhelm was forced to sign the Fifth Treaty of Venlo with Charles, which obliged him to side with Charles V in the fight against the Reformation and the French troops. On September 10, 1543, the Duke of Orleans managed to take possession of Luxembourg, but it was too late, since by this time France had lost its only ally in the Holy Roman Empire. In turn, Charles V, after suppressing the rebellion of Duke William, advanced towards the main French army under the command of Francis I. Francis decided not to engage in battle with the imperial army and chose to retreat from the vicinity of Reims. On August 6, 1543, the combined Franco-Ottoman fleet landed troops in the vicinity of Nice and began the siege of the city. Already on August 15, the Franco-Ottoman army managed to make a breach in the walls of Nice and break through into the city. A battle ensued on the streets of the city, and on August 22, Nice came under the control of the Franco-Ottoman army. The remnants of the city's garrison took up defensive positions in the citadel and refused to capitulate. After some time, having plundered the city, the Allied squadron went for wintering in the vicinity of Toulon. At this time, the imperial troops in Lombardy under the command of Davalos began to move towards Turin, near which the French army under the command of François de Bourbon was located. The Imperials did not dare to attack the French army, but instead focused on capturing the enemy's outlying strongholds. The French did the same and laid siege to the cities of Ivrea. At this time, the Imperial army occupied the city of Carignano, which was located near Turin. The Imperials began to fortify the city, planning to use it as a springboard to attack Turin. In the early spring of 1544, the French, having received reinforcements, began active operations. They laid siege to Carignano in the hope that Davalos would try to lift the siege of the city and be forced into a pitched battle. In early May, Charles V prepared two armies for the invasion of France. One army under the command of Ferrante Gonzaga was located near the Luxembourg occupied by the French, and the second, which was personally led by Charles V, was located in the Kirkfalls. The attack was launched by the army of Gonzaga, who occupied Luxembourg and began moving deep into French territory. At this time, in Lombardy, Davalos was waiting for reinforcements in the form of lanzknechts hired by Charles V, and only after their arrival, advanced towards Carignano. Having learned about the offensive of the Imperial army, de Bourbon took a convenient position and began to wait for the arrival of the enemy. On April 10, 1544, the Imperial army occupied the village of Ceresole, Alba, which was located about 8 kilometers from the position of the French army. The French officers urged de Bourbon to immediately attack the enemy, but he decided to fight in the positions he had previously occupied and was inactive. On April 11, 1544, the French army advanced towards the enemy, taking up positions in an open area perfectly suitable for cavalry maneuvers. By the time the battle began, under the command of de Bourbon there were 13,000 infantrymen, 1,850 horsemen and 20 guns. Under the command of Davalos there were about 18,000 infantry, 1,000 horsemen and 20 guns. The French were on high ground. Since the center of their army was located at the highest point, the French flanks could not see each other. De Bourbon placed Swiss mercenaries in the center, on the flanks of which were French gendarmes. The left flank of the army consisted of Italian infantry and light cavalry. On the right flank was the French infantry and light cavalry. The center of the Imperial army consisted of lanzknechts, on the right flank of which the Imperial cavalry was stationed. The right flank of the Imperial army consisted of Spanish infantry, as well as Italian light cavalry. The left flank of the Imperial army consisted of Italian infantry and cavalry. At the very beginning of the battle, Davalos sent a detachment of arquebusiers to reconnoiter the positions of the enemy. In turn, the French also sent a detachment of arquebusiers to attack, which were supposed to detain the imperial army and reconnoiter its positions. A fierce exchange of fire ensued between the French and imperial arquebusiers, which lasted for about 4 hours. Around the same time, an active artillery exchange of fire began. Very soon, the French arquebusiers were attacked by the imperial cavalry. The French light cavalry hastily advanced to help their arquebusiers. Observing the maneuvers of the French, Davalos ordered his entire army to launch an attack. A full-scale battle broke out. On the flank, the French light cavalry managed to overturn the Italian light cavalry and force them to retreat to their infantry. Pursuing the enemy, the French cavalry attacked the Italian infantry column and managed to upset its battle formations. At this time, in the center, the Landsknechts encountered French infantrymen and Swiss mercenaries. In the midst of the battle, the French heavy cavalry attacked the flank of the Landsknechts, breaking their battle formation. To save his Landsknechts, Davalos sent his heavy cavalry to attack. The heavy imperial cavalry tried to attack the Swiss, but they met them with pikes and arquebus fire. Having suffered serious losses, but without destroying the Swiss battle formation, the imperial cavalry left the battlefield. By this time, the Landsknechts began to retreat, trying to maintain battle formation. They were pursued by French and Swiss infantry. Thus, the Landsknechts, retreating, continued to suffer serious losses. In the end, only a small part of the Landsknechts could leave the battlefield and stay alive. In the northern part of the battlefield, the French managed to defeat the imperial cavalry, but by this time the Italian infantry had fled from the battlefield under the blows of the Imperials. Not having time to build on their success, the imperial infantry was attacked by the French heavy cavalry. The gendarmes attacked the positions of the imperial infantry over and over again, trying to break the enemy line. The imperial infantry were gaining the upper hand, but at that moment they were attacked by the French and Swiss infantry, who completed the pursuit of the Landsknechts. Outnumbered, the Imperials tried to resist, but after suffering serious losses, the surviving Imperials were forced to surrender. Despite the victory, the French were unable to continue the offensive in Lombardy. The fact is that Francis expected a joint attack by Henry VIII and Charles V on France, so he ordered most of the army to leave Lombardy. Thus, the forces remaining at the disposal of de Bourbon were not enough to storm Milan. De Bourbon tried to operate with the remaining army, which consisted only of Italian mercenaries, but was defeated by the imperial troops under the command of Davalos. After the defeat of the French army, the fighting in Lombardy ceased and both sides took up defensive positions. On July 8, an army under the command of Gonzaga reached the outskirts of Saint Dizier and began the siege of the city. Some time later, the Second Imperial Army, which was personally commanded by Charles V, reached the vicinity of Saint Dizier. At this time, an English army of 40,000 soldiers landed in Calais. Charles V demanded that the English restart moving towards Paris, but Henry VIII divided his army into two parts in order to simultaneously besiege the cities of Montreux and Boulogne. On August 17, 1544, severely food-starved, the defenders of Saint Dizier agreed to surrender the city in exchange for the freedom to leave. After occupying the city, the imperial army continued its offensive and very soon the cities of Epernay, Châtillon, Sur-Marne, Château, Thierry and Soissons fell into the hands of Charles V. The French army did not take active actions all this time, but instead took up defensive positions to prevent the Imperials from crossing the Marne River. On September 11, the English breached the citadel of Boulogne, forcing the city's garrison to capitulate. It would seem that the situation is developing as favorable as possible for Charles V, but as usual, at the most inopportune moment, he ran out of money and began to look for a way to quickly end the war on favorable terms for himself. Already on September 18, 1544, a peace treaty was concluded between France and the Holy Roman Empire in Crépy. Under the terms of this treaty, the borders between the states were to return to the state at the end of 1538. At the same time, the French king had to renounce his claims to the Kingdom of Naples, and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire from his claims to the Duchy of Burgundy. The younger son of the king, the Duke of Orleans, could marry one of the daughters of Charles V, Mary or Anna. In the first case, he received the Netherlands and French Comte as a devotee, and in the second case, the Duchy of Milan. Francis, in turn, had to transfer to his son the Duchy of Bourbon, Châtellerault and Angoulême, and also renounce claims to the Duchy of Savoy. Despite the discontent of the English king and the Ottoman Sultan, Charles V and Francis I had the opportunity to resolve their long-standing dispute. Everything could have worked out, but in 1545 the Duke of Orleans died. After making peace with Charles V, Francis directed all his forces to fight against the British. The advancing French army was able to lift the siege of the city of Montreux, pushing back the English troops from it. Since most of the English army took up defensive positions in Calais, the advancing French army managed to reach the outskirts of Boulogne without meeting resistance and begin the siege of the city. The siege of Boulogne progressed very slowly, so Francis decided to attack the English kingdom in order to force Henry VIII to make peace and return all the occupied territories. The French fleet went to sea and, not far from the coast, entered into battle with the English ships. In this battle, no one could win. Continuing to move, the French fleet on August 15 landed troops on the English coast. But after some time, not daring to start moving deep into England, the French boarded ships and returned to their homeland. By September 1545, all the monarchs who took part in the war ran out of money, and they were forced to start negotiations. The peace was concluded on June 7, 1546. Under its terms, Boulogne remained under the rule of Henry VIII until Francis paid a ransom of 2 million ECU for it. This war became the most costly conflict of its time. To compensate for the losses, the monarchs had to seriously increase the amount of taxes, which of course caused great discontent among the population. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell.